Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. This week's video is a requested video. The request comes from a friend of mine and she has asked, could I sew up something that's in a stretch fabric, doesn't require an overlocker and is super basic? So I think that's what I've come up with in my little Bardot top. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a mixed fabric of polyester and viscose. It has stretch in both directions and it's in this lovely stripe design. And on to the cutting out. So this is my front bodice, my fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have a little notch at the neck in the centre, and onto the back. Exactly the same thing here again, my fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have that same notch at the neck in the centre. So that's my bodice pieces cut out. So now I'm ready to join my back to my front at the side seams. So I'm just laying my back bodice over my front, wrong sides together and pinning those side seams, ready to sew. So because I'm not using an overlocker, I've chosen to French seam here. So I'm stitching at half of my seam allowance, and throughout I'll be using a size 70 needle and a 3mm stitch length. This allows you to sew up stretch fabric without using a zigzag stitch and, the purpose of this video, without using an overlocker. So now I just need to trim off that excess seam allowance. So I'm taking away about 2/3 or so here, and now to give that a good press, so I'm just pressing the seam allowance to one side. This will help me out when I come to sew the second line of stitching. So now pulling my bodice through so it is now right sides together and pressing that seam. And what I'm trying to do here is get that seam that I've just sewn to be right on the edge of the crease. So you can see that here. Pinning and ready to sew. And again, I'm going to stitch here at half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start, back stitching at the end. So that's that done. It just needs a little bit of a press. So I went ahead and done that off camera, and this is how it looks. And now I'm ready to finish off my armholes. So to do that, I've chosen a bias finish. So this is just a strip of the outer fabric. It's about 1.5 inches or so wide. And I'm just pinning that to the top of the armhole on one side. And I'm stitching here at my 1cm seam allowance. I'm making tiny little adjustments as I sew round that beautiful curve of the armhole. Being really careful here, taking it nice and slow. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance in exactly the same way as I did the side seams. So I'm going to take off here about 2/3. So that's how that looks. Give it a nice press. So I'm pressing the seam allowance towards the bias. And now I'm ready to understitch. So from the top of the fabric, I'm going to stitch directly through that seam allowance that I've just trimmed and pressed. Back stitching at the start. Again, taking it nice and slowly here. And this understitching is just going to help this little bit of edging to sit nice and flat in underneath. So that's how that looks. And now to finish the armhole, I just need to double fold this little bit of fabric to the inside. So folding once, twice, giving myself a nice crease line along the edge and pinning. And of course I do that on both sides. So that's how it looks when it's all pinned. And I'm ready to stitch now right along that crease edge. So back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way around, back stitching at the end, and that's my armholes all nicely finished, super neat and tidy. So again, I've given those a little bit of a press off camera, and now I'm ready to finish the hem. So I'm going to do a double folded hem here. So I'm folding about a half or so of my seam allowance, pressing, and then folding again. And then off camera, I just pin that in place. So that's how that looks. And ready to stitch. So starting at the side seam, and stitching right along that crease edge. Using that same stitch length that I have been using, the 3mm. And that's how that looks. So I've given that a nice press. So that's my bodice complete. So now to finish the neck. So I've just cut myself a rectangle of fabric. It's about 60 inches in length and the depth is about 10 inches or so. I cut this on the fold and I have a little notch at the top and bottom at the fold line. So I want to make this piece of fabric into a tube. So to do that, I'm lining up right sides together, my two short ends, and pinning. And stitching here at my 1cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. And off camera, I've just given that a nice press. So now I need to join up the long ends. So I'm just lining those up wrong sides together and pinning. Ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start. And all I'm doing here is joining these ends together. That will make it a lot easier for me to do the next step. Back stitching at the end. That's how that looks. So now I'm going to line up those notches you see me snip earlier on the bodice and the band and pin. So that's the centers lined up. Now for the armholes. And then the same thing on the back. And ready to stitch. So I'm just going to stitch directly over the top of the line of stitches you just seen me sew on the band. Back stitching at the start. Back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And I do exactly the same thing on the back, so you can see that here. So now I want to give myself that little lip that sits right on the top of the elastic. So to do that, I'm just pinching the fabric from the band and lifting it up about an inch or so above that stitch line you've just seen me sew. Giving the whole thing a nice press. And that's how that looks. So now to hide this seam line and also give myself a little bit of casing for my elastic, I've cut myself a strip of fabric that's about 1.5 inches or so wide and the length is about 60 inches. I've just joined together the short ends and here I'm just pressing each of the long ends by my 1cm seam allowance. And once it's all pressed, this is how it looks. So now lining up my casing with my centre back and I'm pinning through all layers here. So I'm lining one edge of my casing up with the seam allowance and pinning through the casing, through the seam allowance and through the band. And I'll do that the whole way around. Once done, this is how it looks and ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Trying to stick to that seam allowance the whole way around. This stitch line is going to be visible on the outside of this little top, so I want it to be as neat as possible. Back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So now I just need to press my casing up towards the top of the band, tuck my edge in underneath and pin. So I show that a little bit more close up here. So I'm just folding right along that crease line that I pressed earlier and pinning. So this is going to give me a lovely clean finish on the inside, hiding away all of the raw edges. So love that. So once it's all pinned, this is how it looks. And I've popped in some double pins right at the centre back, about 1 inch apart. I need a little gap to feed my elastic through, and that will just be my reminder to stop stitching at my double pins. So starting at one set of those double pins, back stitching and stitching right along that crease edge. Again, trying to be as neat as possible here, as this stitch line will be seen from the outside. And then once I get to my double pins again, back stitching to finish. So that's my elastic casing all attached. Nice and neat. So now I only have one more thing to do, and that is to feed in my elastic into that little gap. So I've just popped a safety pin on one end of my elastic and just feeding that through that little gap. And once it's all fed through, this is how it looks. So now I just need to join those two ends. So just overlapping them by about 1.5 inches and zigzag stitching back and forth over the top. So that's how that looks. And now the very last thing I have to do is just close up that little gap. So just running that same 3mm stitch length right along that crease edge, back stitching at the start and the end. And with that, this little top is complete. So I've got that lovely casing all in place around the neck. I've got that nice lip above the casing, my bias bound armholes, French seamed along the sides, and my hem all in place. And this is what it looks like on. So this is just a super basic little pattern. You've just seen it's quite quick and straightforward to put together, even without an overlocker. You can wear the band in a few different ways. I've posted a few pics recently over on Instagram of another version I've made of this that has a little bit more of a dramatic band. But anyway, super quick, super easy, stretch top made without an overlocker.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!